When someone learns to crochet, what is the very first shape that they learn to make? If you said a rectangle, you would be correct. Now, rectangles aren't particularly exciting of a shape to crochet, but it is necessary to make a bunch of rectangles when you first start learning so you can practice your stitches and learn how to work rows back and forth evenly. So I thought I would put together a video of 8 different ideas that you can crochet using just rectangles. So that way, if you're just starting out and all you know how to work is rows back and forth, here are 8 projects you'll be able to make. But even if you've been crocheting for a while, these projects are pretty fun. And because they're a rectangle, they're a great simple project if you need to take a break from a more complex project. Okay, so number 1, we have to get this one out of the way. This is what just about everybody first makes when they learn how to crochet, but a scarf. A scarf is basically a really long, really thin rectangle. What's fun with a scarf is you can either work really narrow rows to make your rectangle, or you can work really long and wide rows and just do a few of those stacked up to make your rectangle. But with scarves, you of course can change color as many times as you want, or you can even put together a patchwork scarf where you make a bunch of smaller squares and rectangles and then sew them together to make a scarf. Crochet rectangle project number 2 is to make a pocket shawl. Now, if you're not familiar with the pocket shawl, the easiest way to describe it is picture a really wide, oversized scarf and stick pockets on it. So basically, you need to make one big rectangle that's as long and as wide as you want the base of the shawl to be, and then 2 smaller rectangles to be the pockets, and just sew around 3 sides of the smaller rectangle to attach it to the big shawl. Now, there's a lot of pocket shawl patterns out there that use very complex stitches and create really neat textures, but even if you're just starting out, this can still turn out really pretty using just basic simple stitches. And if you're working with just one basic single stitch, you of course can pick a yarn that has a lot of texture or a lot of color to add some interest. The third idea I have for you is to crochet a hot pad. Now, I do highly recommend that you use cotton yarn if you're going to crochet a hot pad. My little square I crocheted here, I just used some random scrap yarn, so it's not cotton. And yes, I know it's kind of silly that I'm setting the pot on the stove on a hot pad, but anyways, that's just for illustration purposes. Hopefully you get the idea. But anyways, you want to use cotton because yarns like acrylic have the potential to melt when you place really hot dishes on them. In the past, I have crocheted an acrylic hot pad, but whenever I used it, I made sure to use it with things that I knew were not super hot. And every time I was using it, I was kind of taking that gamble and that potential of melting the yarn. So I would definitely recommend you avoid that issue altogether by using cotton yarn. Idea number 4 is to crochet a rectangle coaster. And of course, you can make these rectangular or square. This is basically the same idea as the hot pad, just a little smaller. Now, if you're planning to use your coaster for cold beverages, then you'd be fine using just about any kind of yarn. But again, if you're going to be putting very hot cups onto your coaster, you probably want to stick with something like cotton, so that way you don't run the risk of melting the acrylic yarn. Idea number 5 that you can make using just a crochet rectangle is this cute stuffed bunny rabbit. Now, I have a video showing the whole process, and I will link to that up in the cards. And one thing I do want to mention is this project is a little bit better suited towards knitting or Tunisian crochet simply because those stitches are tighter, so when we sew it up and stuff it, it tends to work out just a little bit better. But I do think this project could be achieved using single crochet stitches, especially if you work them very tightly and use very thin yarn. So be sure to check that video out, but now you kind of know what it looks like. It's very cute, and the best part is, even though it looks complicated, all you have to crochet is a square. Idea number 6 is to crochet an iPad stand. So I'm going to use this rectangle that I crocheted and show you in this video how to assemble it. Before we get into that though, this is what I made using scrap yarn using my magic yarn ball. I'll link to that video, but it's a great way to use up scraps in your yarn stash. This is about 21 inches by, we'll say 11.5 inches tall. I'm going to use some scrap yarn to sew it together, and I'm going to do all my sewing by just slip stitching together, but of course you could get out a needle and actually stitch it together. So the first thing I'm going to do is fold it in half widthwise and sew this edge together. Again, you can use a needle or you can do slip stitches like I'm going to do. So I've seamed this whole edge together. It's a little sloppy looking. I personally don't mind that. And of course I can inside out if I want that seam to the inside. So it's kind of like a tube at this point. And what I want to do next is I want to pick a side and seam one of these sides just straight down. So I'm just going to continue with my yarn and slip stitch all along this top edge. So at this point I've sewn that edge together, and I decided I am going to inside out it. So now at this stage, I'm going to stuff it part way so I can figure out how far down I want my next seam to be. That'll make sense in a moment. I like to stuff a lot of my stuff with my scrap yarn that I cut off from tail ends when I weave things in, but I obviously don't have enough for the whole thing, so I'll use some polyfill for the rest of it. But I'm going to start stuffing the project. And be sure to work the stuffing all the way to the corners. Now I'm going to stuff it pretty firmly, but I don't want to stuff it all the way full because we're going to need to make another seam and then stuff another section. So basically the way this iPad stand works is we will turn our project on its side like such, and then we're going to seam along this way, and then the iPad will rest against here. So I'm stuffing it first so I can figure out if I have enough stuffing in there and if I like where it sits, and I think I do. The iPad stand will sit a little something like this. And right about here along this yellow and white is where I want to seam across. So again, I'm going to use my yarn and my hook to stitch across that section. You of course can use a needle if that's easier for you. So I've stitched almost all the way across. I'm gonna make sure that I don't want to add any more stuffing. I think I'm probably good, so I'll finish stitching the rest of the way across. The last step is to stuff this section and seam it closed. I'm going to sew most of the way closed and then use the last little bit of opening to stuff it and then finish it off. And now the iPad stand is finished and an iPad can rest right here. Idea number 7 is to make a rug or a doormat. And of course, a rug would be a lot bigger, doormat's a little bit smaller. And I'm using that same rectangle from the iPad stand just for illustration purposes in front of the door and in front of the stove. It's probably a little bit small, but hopefully you get the idea. But again, you're just making a rectangle, whatever size you want, use whatever yarn you want. It's a great way to use up scrap yarn. And because it's such a large rectangle, you will get plenty of practice in with those basic stitches and how to work them evenly in the row. And my 8th and final idea is to make a very simple bag. So all you have to do is you take a large rectangle, fold it in half, and then seam up the 2 sides, leaving the top open. And then of course you can add handles of any kind. You could crochet really long, thin rectangles for the handles, or you could add a braided handle or whatever kind of handle you want, and you'll have a very simple bag made from a rectangle. So I hope you enjoy these 8 crochet rectangle projects. Even though a rectangle is very simple, there's a lot of fun ways we can use it and lots of neat projects that it can form the basis for. And if you're starting out, these projects are a great way to practice your stitches and practice working evenly without being stuck with just making 5 million scarves. And even if you've been crocheting for a long time, I hope you enjoy these projects too. And as I mentioned, a lot of these are great stash busters. Now, of course, the rectangle is the first shape that we learn in crochet, but the second shape we learn in crochet generally is how to make a circle, how to work in the round. So I will have an upcoming video very similar to this where I show different projects you can make using just a crochet circle. So be sure to subscribe and come back for that video. But that wraps up today's video. Get to work making those crochet rectangles, and until next time, happy crafting.